My friends, everything around the Pittsburgh Steelers right now is tied to one simple reality. This team survived its most difficult moment of the season without one of its most important players, and now that player is back just in time for the playoffs. DK Metcalf walked back into the locker room after serving his suspension, and what stood out immediately was not just his presence, but the reaction around him. This was not a quiet return. Teammates clearly felt his absence, owned it, and more importantly, proved something to themselves while he was gone. The wide receiver room, in particular, took it personally. There was a sense that they needed to win at least one of those games so Metcalf could come back with the season still alive, and that mindset shaped everything that followed. Metcalf didn't want to dwell on the incident that led to the suspension. He offered no details and made it clear he was surprised the suspension was upheld after the appeal, but the bigger takeaway was how connected he stayed with the team. He was texting teammates before the game, reminding them they had everything they needed. For younger players like Calvin Austin III, that kind of support matters. It showed up on the field. Austin caught the game-winning touchdown in the biggest moment of his career so far. Marquez Valdes-Scantling made key catches. Adam Thielen contributed in crucial situations. Pat Freiermuth continued to be a reliable target. This was a receiving group that had to grow up fast, and they did it in the middle of a must-win AFC North fight. The Steelers didn't just survive that game against Baltimore, they found something. Nearly 400 passing yards in a Week 18, win-or-go-home game against a division rival is not an accident. This wasn't garbage-time production or a fluky performance. This was an offense that found rhythm, balance, and confidence. Aaron Rodgers looked comfortable, decisive, and in control, even without his top target. That matters now more than ever, because Metcalf's return doesn't reset the offense. It adds a dangerous new layer to something that was already working. What's fascinating is how this timing could actually benefit Pittsburgh. While Metcalf was out, Rodgers built chemistry with Valdes-Scantling, Thielen, Austin, and Freiermuth. Arthur Smith and Rodgers continued to refine how this passing game functions. The offense evolved. Now Metcalf steps back in as a true number one presence, a receiver who commands attention, stretches the field, and forces defenses to declare their intentions. That kind of gravity changes everything. Defenses can't simply sit on intermediate routes or focus on the tight end. Someone is going to get a favorable matchup, and Rodgers is experienced enough to find it. This all comes as the Steelers prepare to face a Houston Texans defense that is talented, disciplined, and physical. This will not be easy. Derek Stingley Jr. is one of the best cover corners in the league, and getting Metcalf back does not automatically solve every problem. The Steelers will still need contributions from everyone else. But that's exactly why what happened against Baltimore matters so much. This team proved it can function as a unit, spread the ball around, and execute under pressure. They didn't need one player to save them. They needed belief, execution, and toughness, and they showed all three. There's also a quiet confidence forming around this group. Outside the building, expectations remain low. Many around the league still look at the Steelers as the least threatening team in the AFC playoffs. Inside the locker room, though, there's a different feeling. They won their division. They protected home field. Houston now has to come to Pittsburgh, into cold weather, into a hostile environment, against a team that just went through a war and came out stronger. The Steelers are not loud about it, but they know what they just accomplished. Perhaps the most intriguing part is that this offense still feels unfinished. The run game has shown flashes without fully taking over a game. Protection has improved, even with injuries along the offensive line. Rodgers is settling in. When the run and pass complement each other, this unit becomes far more dangerous than many expected earlier in the season. If what we saw against Baltimore is a preview of what this offense can be with Metcalf back on the field, then the Steelers are bringing something into the playoffs that opponents haven't fully prepared for on tape. This is not about hype. It's about timing, growth, and a team that learned it could win without relying on a single star, only to get that star back at the most important moment. Now the question shifts from survival to possibility. With DK Metcalf back, chemistry built, and confidence rising, how far do you think this version of the Steelers' offense can really go in the playoffs? What makes this moment even more compelling is how complete the Steelers' response has been on both sides of the ball, because while the offense grabbed headlines, the foundation of this win and this surge was built in the trenches. Against Baltimore, a team that prides itself on physical dominance, Pittsburgh did not flinch. They gave up explosive plays, yes, but outside of those moments, they controlled the line of scrimmage in a way that changed the entire texture of the game. Derrick Henry's final numbers look imposing until you strip away the two long runs. Once the Steelers adjusted, the run game was largely contained, especially in the second half, and that resilience defined the night. Cam Hayward was everywhere. This was one of those games where his impact went beyond the stat sheet. He set the tone early, controlled gaps, disrupted blocking schemes, and reminded everyone why he remains the emotional and physical core of this defense. Alongside him, Keanu Benton was a force on the interior, repeatedly winning at the point of attack against a highly respected offensive line. This was not just about strength, but timing, leverage, and preparation. The Ravens tried to lean on familiarity, and the Steelers responded with discipline and violence in the right moments. On the edges, the rotation of T.J. Watt, Alex Highsmith, and Nick Herbig was as effective as it has been all season. Watt did not need a sack to change the game. His interception was massive, and his presence alone altered how Lamar Jackson navigated the pocket. Highsmith generated pressure consistently and was inches away from a play that could have ended the game earlier. Herbig's snaps, though limited, were impactful, particularly when he was moved around and used creatively. The message was clear: Lamar Jackson was not going to be comfortable, and he never was. The secondary tells a more complicated story, and that complexity matters going forward. Joey Porter Jr. and James Pierre were largely avoided, which speaks volumes. When quarterbacks stop throwing in your direction, that is respect earned the hard way. But the safeties paid the price for the aggressive approach. Big plays came through the air, and that cannot be ignored. Jalen Ramsey and Kyle Duggar had moments they will want back, moments where hesitation or miscommunication led to touchdowns that kept Baltimore alive. At the same time, the constant movement, disguises, and late adjustments clearly disrupted Lamar's reads. This defense accepted risk in order to control rhythm, and while it wasn't perfect, it worked. Offensively, the growth up front may be the most encouraging sign of all. Zach Frazier and Mason McCormick were outstanding, giving Aaron Rodgers clean pockets and creating movement in the run game. Jaylen Warren ran with a level of violence that wore the Ravens down, forcing missed tackles and making defenders question whether they wanted any part of him late in the game. Even without a dominant, full-game rushing performance, the Steelers ran effectively enough to keep the offense balanced, and that balance is what allowed the passing game to flourish. Rodgers, in this context, deserves special attention. This was not a vintage performance built on highlight throws alone. This was about control, command, and decision-making. He took what the defense gave him, trusted his protection, and elevated everyone around him. Doing that without DK Metcalf on the field made it even more impressive. Now, with Metcalf back, the equation changes. Defenses can no longer compress the field the same way. They cannot cheat safety help as freely. That opens space for Freiermuth, for Austin, for Valdez-Scantling, and even for backs leaking out of the backfield. There's also a psychological edge here that should not be underestimated. This team faced a moment where everything could have unraveled. Instead, they responded with their most complete effort of the season against their biggest rival. They swept Baltimore. They proved their front office vision of building through the trenches is paying off. They showed that young players can rise in the biggest moments. And now they head into the playoffs with momentum, confidence, and a roster that is closer to whole than it has been in weeks. The Texans are a different challenge. They are unfamiliar, athletic, and well-coached. But they are also walking into a situation where the Steelers have already tested themselves under maximum pressure in past. There is a belief forming in that locker room that this team is not done, that what they showed in Week 18 was not the ceiling, but the baseline. If the offense continues to evolve, if the defense tightens up the few areas that hurt them, and if this team continues to embrace its physical identity, Pittsburgh becomes a dangerous out in January. Now it's your turn. Let me know in the comments what you think this version of the Steelers can do in the playoffs, whether DK Metcalf's return changes your expectations, and how confident you are heading into this matchup. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and keep an eye out for the next video on your screen where we continue breaking down everything happening with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And as this story keeps unfolding, the most important thing to understand is that the Steelers are no longer guessing about who they are. Earlier in the season, there were moments where this team felt like it was still searching for an identity, trying to figure out whether it wanted to lean on defense, protect the quarterback, or simply survive week to week. That phase is over. What emerged from that Ravens game was clarity. This is a team built to absorb pressure, respond to adversity, and win games that demand toughness more than perfection. The offense is now operating with layers instead of desperation. When DK Metcalf steps back onto the field, he is not being asked to rescue the unit. He is being added to a structure that already proved it can function, adapt, and produce without him. That changes how defenses prepare. You can no longer sell out to stop one player or one concept. If you double Metcalf, you leave space elsewhere. If you play it straight, you risk Rodgers exploiting matchups with experience and precision. This is the kind of dilemma Pittsburgh hasn't consistently created for opponents in recent years, especially in high-stakes games. What also stands out is how connected this roster looks. You can see it in the way players talk about each other, in how younger contributors stepped up without hesitation, and in how veterans like Cam Hayward and Aaron Rodgers set the standard without making it about themselves. This is not a loud team. It's a grounded one, and that mindset matters when the margin for error shrinks in the postseason. Defensively, there is still work to be done, and no one inside the building is pretending otherwise. Explosive plays must be reduced. Communication in the secondary has to be sharper, but the upside is clear. The pass rush is relentless, the interior is physical, and the corners are playing with confidence. When those elements come together, this defense can dictate terms instead of reacting. Against Houston, that will be critical, because giving a young quarterback clean looks and easy throws is exactly how you let a game slip away. The Steelers also benefit from something that doesn't show up in stats: experience in chaos. This team just played a season-defining game where every snap mattered, every mistake was magnified, and every adjustment carried weight. They came out of it not just alive, but stronger. That carries over. Playoff football rewards teams that are comfortable being uncomfortable, and Pittsburgh just proved it can live in that space. This isn't about predicting a Super Bowl run or setting unrealistic expectations. It's about acknowledging that the Steelers have put themselves in a position where belief is reasonable. They are healthier. They are more cohesive. They are playing their best football at the right time. And with DK Metcalf back in the lineup, the ceiling is undeniably higher than it was 2 weeks ago. So now, before the next kickoff, the conversation shifts from can they survive to what happens if this keeps building. That's the question that will define this playoff run. If you made it this far, drop your thoughts in the comments. How far do you believe this team can go if they keep playing this way? What makes this stretch so intriguing is that nothing about it feels accidental. This isn't a team riding unsustainable plays or hoping for breaks. The Steelers are winning because their structure is finally matching their intent. You can see it in how patient the offense has become, in how the defense bends without completely breaking, and in how situational football is no longer a weakness. Third downs, red zone moments, late game possessions, these are areas where Pittsburgh used to tighten up or fade. Against Baltimore, they leaned into those moments instead of surviving them. That's also why the return of DK Metcalf feels different from a typical star comes back just in time storyline. This isn't about forcing targets or redesigning the offense around him. It's about inserting a premier weapon into a system that already discovered answers. Metcalf now becomes the stress test for defenses that are already being pulled horizontally and vertically. His ability to win downfield changes coverage shells. His physicality changes how corners play at the line. Even on snaps where he doesn't touch the ball, his presence reshapes the entire picture, and that ripple effect extends beyond the passing game. When defenses back off, the run game benefits. Jaylen Warren becomes even more dangerous when linebackers hesitate for half a second. Play action becomes more effective. Tight ends find space in the seams. Everything connects. That's what real offensive growth looks like, and it's something the Steelers haven't consistently shown in January football in recent years. There's also an edge forming with this group, a quiet defiance rooted in being underestimated. Around the league, the narrative still leans toward what the Steelers can't do, who they can't beat, and why their path is too difficult. Inside that locker room, those conversations don't matter. They already faced a moment where the season should have slipped away, and it didn't. That experience creates trust. Trust in preparation. Trust in teammates. Trust in the process that brought them here. No one in Pittsburgh is claiming this team is flawless. They know mistakes were made. They know explosive plays must be cleaned up, but they also know that improvement is happening at the right time. Momentum in the playoffs isn't about style points. It's about confidence, health, and execution when everything tightens. Right now, the Steelers are checking those boxes. This is the stage where identity becomes everything. Physical football, relentless pressure, smart quarterback play, contributions from unexpected places. That's how Pittsburgh has historically made noise in January, and that blueprint is starting to reappear. Whether it leads to one win or something more will be decided on the field, but the foundation is no longer theoretical. It's real, it's tested, and it's growing. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe this team has turned a corner at the right moment, or do you still need to see more before buying in? There's also something important happening beneath the surface that doesn't get enough attention, and that's how this roster is learning to trust its own growth in real time. Earlier in the year, when things went wrong, you could feel the tension. One mistake led to another. A missed assignment snowballed. That fragility is gone. Against Baltimore, the Steelers gave up big plays, missed opportunities, and still never lost control of themselves. That's a mental shift, and in playoff football, that shift can be the difference between folding and advancing. Look at how the coaching staff handled that game. There was no panic, no abandonment of the plan. Adjustments were made, but the identity stayed intact. The defense continued to disguise coverage. The offense stayed balanced. The run game wasn't dominant, but it was trusted. The passing game wasn't reckless, but it was aggressive when it needed to be. That kind of composure reflects a group that understands who it is and what it wants to do, even when things aren't perfect. And that brings us back to timing. This version of the Steelers is not peaking because everything suddenly became easy. They're peaking because they've been forced to solve problems under pressure. Losing DK Metcalf for 2 games wasn't convenient. Playing a must-win rivalry game wasn't forgiving. But those moments accelerated development. They forced players into bigger roles. They forced Rodgers to build chemistry on the fly. They forced the defense to win without margin for error. Now, instead of those experiences being liabilities, they're assets. What's especially dangerous for opponents is that this team still feels underestimated externally. That creates hunger. It sharpens focus. When you combine that with a veteran quarterback who understands playoff football, a defensive front that can take over stretches of a game, and a receiving group that now has both depth and star power, you get a team no one is excited to face. Not flashy, not trendy, just difficult. The path ahead won't be forgiving. Every opponent left is capable. Every mistake will be punished. But the Steelers aren't walking into that environment blind anymore. They've already lived in it. They've already survived it. And now they get to add DK Metcalf back into a group that learned how to fight without him. That's why this moment matters. Not because it guarantees anything, but because it proves something fundamental has changed. This team isn't hoping for answers. They believe they have them. The next game will test that belief immediately, and the response will tell us just how real this evolution is. And when you step back and really look at the bigger picture, this stretch says as much about the Steelers' internal stability as it does about any single matchup. This is a franchise that has been criticized for years for being stuck in the middle, competitive but not dangerous, relevant but not feared. What's different now is that the Steelers are no longer trying to convince themselves they belong. They've already proven it in the most unforgiving environment possible,